The courtyard remained alive with normal activity throughout the course of their conversation, but for a brief moment, Guadalupe and La Malinche existed outside of it. The weight of their exchange lingered between them, unspoken truths, acknowledged choices, and paths that had long since diverged. La Malinche was the first to shift. Her posture straightened slightly, her expression easing just enough to allow something more familiar to surface beneath the resolve. "It was good to see you," she said quietly. The words were simple, but not empty. "It was," she replied. La Malinche gave a small nod. "We should speak again," she added, "when there is more time." Guadalupe hesitated only briefly before nodding in agreement. "Yes," she said, "we should." Neither of them made promises beyond that, because both understood time was no longer something either of them controlled. La Malinche rose first. Guadalupe followed a second later. For a moment, they stood facing each other once more. Then, without further words, La Malinche turned and returned to her escorts, her place beside the Spaniards re-established as if it had never been interrupted. Guadalupe remained where she was, watching her go. Elsewhere within the palace grounds, Yaotl finally found the man he had been searching for. Tizoc stood among a small group of men near one of the inner storage areas, his attention fixed on the movement of objects being carried in and out. Gold. Everywhere. Ornaments, plates, ceremonial pieces, anything that could be gathered was being sorted, inspected, and prepared for transport. "Dad," Yaotl called as he approached, weaving past the workers. "I've been looking all over for you." Tizoc turned, his expression relaxed as he recognized his son. "We've been busy all morning long, Yaotl," he replied, gesturing vaguely toward the activity around them. "Montezuma has us scouring the palace for anything and everything made of gold to give to his invited guests." He exhaled through his nose, a faint edge in his tone. "It appears their appetite for the precious metal is insatiable." Yaotl glanced at the piles being assembled. Tizoc crossed his arms. "What do you need to see me for anyway?" he asked. "Shouldn't you be at home with your wife and child?" Yaotl shook his head slightly. "Guadalupe's here with me," he said. Tizoc raised an eyebrow. "Here?" Yaotl nodded. "Last night she said she wanted to speak with the woman accompanying Cortez, La Malinche." At that, Tizoc's expression changed. "That slave, daughter-in-law, and now mother of my first grandson," he said slowly, "has a level of ambition that I have not seen in any woman before." Yaotl said nothing, but his silence was not disagreement. It was acknowledgement, reluctant but real. Tizoc looked at him for a moment, then shook his head lightly. "In any case," he continued, "I'm not sure if arranging another meeting for her is the best idea, considering we're not sure how things are likely to proceed." He placed a firm hand on Yaotl's shoulder. "Please tell her to be patient." Yaotl nodded. "I will." What neither of them knew was that Guadalupe had already done exactly what she had come to do, and was now simply waiting for Yaotl's return to the courtyard. The rest of the day unfolded in a steady, relentless rhythm. Tizoc and the others continued their work without pause. Room after room was searched, chambers opened, storage areas emptied. Anything made of gold was gathered and brought forward. The Spaniards received it all, without hesitation, without restraint. At first, Tizoc had simply followed orders. That was his role. That was his duty. But as the hours stretched on, something began to settle uneasily in his mind. It was not the act itself, it was the pattern, the way the Spaniards looked at the gold. Not as something symbolic, not as something sacred, but as something final, something to be taken, kept, and removed. He had seen greed, but this was something deeper. something that seemed as if it had potentially no end to it. Tizoc said nothing, but he began to watch more closely. Days passed, not many, but enough for the tension beneath the surface of Tenochtitlan to begin taking shape. 6 days after their arrival, everything changed. Montezuma, emperor of an empire, became a prisoner in his own palace. The reason, as it was told by the Spaniards, came from the coast, from a place called Nautla. There, a tribute collector named Qualpopoca had led an attack against a Spanish-aligned Totonac garrison. The garrison had been under the command of a captain, Juan de Escalante. The attack was not random, it was in retaliation. Months earlier, the Totonacs had rebelled against Montezuma's authority after aligning themselves with the Spaniards. This was the consequence. The attack had been devastating. Many Totonacs were killed, and among the Spanish, 7 soldiers, including Escalante himself. The news reached Tenochtitlan quickly, and it was seized upon immediately. Some among the Spaniards claimed this was the sole reason for what came next, a necessary and justified response. But others, even among their own ranks, suspected something different. That Escalante's death had simply provided an excuse, an opening, because the truth was harder to ignore. Cortés had placed himself and all of his men deep within the heart of an empire that was not his. Surrounded, outnumbered, and dependent on indigenous allies for support. And he understood that. He had always understood it. To maintain control, he needed leverage, and there was no greater leverage than the emperor himself. Cortés would later admit as much, not publicly, but plainly enough. He had acted not out of reaction, but necessity, perhaps even intention. On the night of November 14th, 1519, the decision was carried out. Cortés requested a private audience with Montezuma. The chamber was quiet, guarded, still. 7 Spanish soldiers and Captain Escalante have been murdered by rebellious factions within your kingdom, Cortés said, his voice measured, controlled. There is great risk that this can turn into something much larger. The words were translated carefully by La Malinche. Montezuma listened without interruption. When he spoke, his tone remained steady. Like I said before, and I say now, he replied, I knew of nothing regarding this cause, and I, nor any Aztec leader under my command, gave no such order to cause this harm to the Spanish crown. There was no hesitation in his voice, only assertion. Cortés nodded slightly. Be that as it may, he said, considering our present circumstances, I have no doubt that you will understand why you must now be held by the Spanish army within the confines of this palace. The words settled heavily, even before they were fully translated. Montezuma assumed correctly as to what Cortés was communicating to him. What does that mean? He asked. Then, more directly, am I now to be held prisoner in my own palace? Cortés did not flinch. I wouldn't look at it like that, he said. His tone shifted, softer, almost reassuring. You will still be emperor. You will still meet with your council. You will still hold ritual ceremonies in front of your people. He stepped slightly closer. You are the emperor. However, he continued, all military correspondence will come under the watchful eye of Spain moving forward, and you will be unable to leave the palace. For your protection. The explanation hung in the air, thin, unconvincing, even as it was spoken. Montezuma said nothing, as he clearly understood his present circumstances. The following day, November 15th, 1519, the shift was complete. Power had changed hands, not through battle, not through open conquest, but through control. Hernán Cortés became the de facto ruler of Mesoamerica, and Montezuma, still emperor in title, became something else entirely. A figurehead, a voice that spoke, but no longer decided. Across the city, the change was felt before it was fully understood. Orders moved differently, guards repositioned, access shifted. and within the palace, the invisible boundaries became very real. Tizoc noticed it immediately. The way Spanish soldiers now stood closer, the way movement was monitored, the way Montezuma's presence, once commanding, felt contained. He said nothing, but his earlier suspicions had now been confirmed. This had never been about alliance. This was about conquest. And Spain now had the upper hand.